Hey guys, let's imagine something for a second. It's not quiet, not completely. You can hear it, wind pressing through tall grass, the low rumble of something big moving through the underbrush, the crackle of a nearby fire that isn't quite tamed. The air smells like smoke, dirt, and meat. And over all of this, layered like a heartbeat under the world, is the sound of people, your people, breathing, working, laughing, struggling, surviving. You're not in a house. There's no roof. There's no streetlight outside. You don't have a toothbrush or a schedule or a calendar with a dentist appointment you keep forgetting to reschedule. You are a human being. But the year is 30,000 B.C., and your day is just beginning. You're what some might still call a caveman. But that word never sat quite right, did it? It makes it sound like you sat in a dark hole all day gnawing on bones. As if you had no thoughts, no rhythm, no systems. As if the only remarkable thing about you was that you lived before someone wrote it all down. The truth. You were an engineer of survival, a philosopher of silence, a quiet observer of the sky and stars, the seasons, the moods of wolves. You made fire from sticks, weapons from stone, and you loved with the same hunger we do today. But let's strip the romance out of it too, because being you, being Paleolithic, meant waking up sore, cold, and half-hungry most mornings. You didn't roll over to check your phone. You scanned the world. The sky, the trees, the smell of the wind. Was there danger? Was there food? Was everyone still breathing? Because survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a daily contract signed with caution and renewed with luck. So let's walk through one of your days. Not the glorified version. Not the Hollywood caveman in a leopard loincloth swinging a club, but the quiet truth of what it actually meant to wake up human, before cities, before clocks, before history. It probably started with the sun. Even if your shelter was a rock overhang or a hut made from mammoth bone and hide, light was your alarm clock. Not the harsh buzz of a ringtone, but the shift in air, the fading of stars, the rising chorus of birds you'd come to know like neighbors. If you were lucky, you had others. Maybe it was your small band of 15 or 20, family not by blood alone, but by fire. You didn't live in isolation. You lived in a tribe, because no one survives alone for long. Not then, not now. Someone stirred the fire first. You always tried to keep it going overnight, feeding it little by little with dry sticks. Losing fire meant a long, painful process to restart it, rubbing wood or striking flint until the spark caught. That flame was your heartbeat. It cooked your food. It warmed your bones. It kept the night from swallowing you whole. Mornings were for movement. Everyone had a task. There were no managers, no emails, but there was rhythm. You gathered. You hunted. You repaired tools, checked traps, braided cordage from plant fibers, inspected the dried meat, skinned hides, shaped flint. And you talked. Not in full sentences maybe, not like we're talking now, but with grunts, gestures, sounds, expressions. Language was growing. It lived in your throats and hands and eyes, because even back then we needed to tell each other things. Warnings, stories, hopes. Now here's the thing, our ancestors weren't rushing. Life didn't tick in 30-minute meetings or coffee breaks. It moved in slow loops. You didn't go to work. Survival was work. The walk to find roots or nuts might take hours. Following tracks of a deer, that could take all day, sometimes two, sometimes more. And the danger was always near. You couldn't afford distraction. Every sound was a signal. A bird's silence might mean a predator nearby. A change in wind direction could mean smoke from a fire not your own. Your ears were always on, your nose too. Your body read the environment like a book long before books were even thought of. Children, they were everywhere, not hidden indoors. They were part of it, watching, mimicking, learning by doing. A 4-year-old might already know how to snare a rabbit or identify bitter roots. Childhood wasn't a bubble. It was apprenticeship lived in real time. Let's talk food. No, you weren't eating raw meat off bones every day like cartoons suggest. If anything, your meals were shockingly diverse. You foraged berries, roots, mushrooms, honey if you were brave. You hunted when you could. Meat was precious, hard-earned, shared, and cooked if the fire held. And believe it or not, there were moments of joy, of ease. A warm afternoon when the hunt went well. A stretch of land flush with tubers and wild garlic. A small pond where the fish practically jumped into your hands. You laughed. You joked. You probably even sang simple rhythmic chants to pass time, to bond, to lull children. Maybe someone in your group was especially good at mimicking animals or telling stories in dramatic pantomime. That was your theater, your Netflix, your way of passing knowledge across generations without a single written word. And when the sun dipped low again, shadows stretching like fingers across the grass, you returned. Not always to a cave, sometimes to a ring of stones where the fire waited, sometimes to a thicket hidden and safe. You didn't need a walled fortress. You had instinct and each other. Evenings were slower. That's when the meat was cooked if there was meat, or roots roasted on coals, or a thin broth made from marrow and herbs. You ate with your fingers, you sat in a circle, you passed what you had. Then came the firelight stories, and these weren't just idle tales. They were memory. Oral maps of the land, myths about the stars, warnings about the river spirits, dreams from last night interpreted as omens. They held your history, your science, your law, your poetry, all spoken, all alive. Then slowly, as the flames faded one by one, you slept. No memory foam mattress, no pillows, just skin and hide and dirt in each other. The warmth of a group curled like a question mark against the cold. You didn't sleep through the night in one long stretch either. No one did back then. You probably slept in shifts, woke briefly, tended the fire, checked the sky, whispered to a child stirring from a dream. You drifted in and out. A polyphasic sleep rhythm scientists are just now rediscovering. And so passed a day, not heroic, not cinematic, but real. And when you zoom out and look at all the days across all the years, you begin to see something else. That this breath, this hunger, this ache to survive and share and shape the world, this is what we are. We are still them. Beneath the suits and screens and schedules, we are still chasing light, still telling stories, still reaching for fire. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you're here now, listening. Because deep down, the old part of you, the part that remembers what it was like to sleep beside a fire, to wake at dawn, to walk for hours in silence, is still listening too. So now the fire is low. The stars overhead have sharpened, the kind of brightness that only appears when there's no artificial light for 100 miles in any direction. You're lying there, maybe on dried grass layered over the hard ground, maybe on a hide still smelling faintly of smoke and fur. The breath of the person beside you is slow, steady. Someone else shifts near the embers, feeding the flame with a splintered branch. No one speaks, but everyone listens, to the night, to the wind, to memory. This was not a life built on convenience. It was built on caution, cooperation, and keen observation. There were no shortcuts. Every success, every bite of food, every warm shelter, every injury survived was earned. Not once, but over and over again. And that meant tools. If you ask someone today what the most important invention in human history is, they might say fire or the wheel or electricity. But for Paleolithic humans, it was stone. Not just any stone. Flint, obsidian, chert, stones that fractured in sharp, predictable ways. These weren't just rocks lying around. They were precision instruments shaped by careful hands. You didn't make tools casually. You made them deliberately. One wrong chip and hours of work were lost. One perfect flake and you had a spear point that could mean food or safety or life. Mornings were often spent working these stones, not as a hobby but as a lifeline. Men and women, both, could be flint knappers. There was no strict division of labor based on gender the way some modern people assume. Everyone learned what they needed to learn. Everyone contributed. Tool kits weren't primitive, they were specialized. There were scrapers for hides, borers for wood, knives for cutting sinew, axes for splitting bones, and each tool was personal, carried, protected, some even buried with the dead, because yes, they buried the dead. Death wasn't ignored or hidden. It was part of life, as regular and real as the rising sun. When someone died, they were grieved, sometimes painted in red ochre, sometimes buried with objects they'd used, not because anyone had a written religion or a priest to dictate doctrine, but because they felt something. Because grief is older than writing, older than agriculture. It's one of the first things that made us human. And speaking of human, what did we look like? Forget the knuckle-dragging cartoon version. Our ancestors stood upright. They were lean, muscled by necessity, not aesthetics. Faces varied, just like today. Skin color depended on geography. Hair, often long, tied, braided, matted. Eyes alert. Posture grounded. They weren't staring at phones or slouching in chairs. Their bodies adapted to a life in motion. Hygiene. It existed, but with different rules. You washed when the dirt became too much or when the smell made others edge away from you by the fire. If there was a stream, you used it. If there was snow, you rubbed it on your skin. You didn't have soap, but you had sand, leaves, ash, even animal fat. Fat could clean, moisturize, and keep bugs away. That's not a spa treatment, that's survival. And teeth, they didn't gleam, but they didn't rot the way ours do either. You didn't sip soda or chew taffy. Your diet was raw, coarse, fibrous. You chewed bones, roots, tendons, and that meant your jaw was stronger. Your face was different, less orthodontic, more powerful. Cavities were rare, but tooth wear was common. Losing teeth was a big deal. That's why some elders were cared for, fed softer foods, protected, because wisdom wasn't wasted. An old body didn't mean a useless one. Let's walk through another day. Say you're 28 years old, already middle-aged in some groups. You rise with the sun. Hunger is the first thought. You check what's left from yesterday. Maybe a strip of dried elk meat hidden high in a tree. Maybe not. If nothing's left, it's foraging day. You don't go alone. That's dangerous. You travel with two others, scanning the undergrowth. You know what to look for, not just by sight, but by scent, by season. Bitterroot in spring, berries in summer, nuts in autumn. Some are poisonous unless roasted. Some mimic safe ones and kill in hours. You know the difference because someone taught you and because someone died learning, while you gather, others hunt. And this isn't running around with a club, it's tracking. Reading signs in broken branches, disturbed leaves, a print in the mud. Maybe it's deer, maybe something bigger. You move quietly, you sweat slowly. You wait hours in stillness, sometimes days, and if the hunt fails, you pivot, catch fish, set snares, dig traps, eat insects if you have to. You do what it takes, because winter's coming, and winter, that's the real boss fight. There are no grocery stores, no blankets stitched in factories. You wear fur stitched with sinew, softened with urine and brain oil. You eat fat when you can because it's energy. You store meat underground, smoked and salted with minerals you gather by hand. You build shelters against wind, against snow, against wolves. You plan ahead. You cooperate, because if you don't, you die. And still there is art. Yes, art. Carved bones, painted cave walls, figurines of animals or faceless women with wide hips and strong thighs. These weren't just decorations, they were symbols, stories, tools for remembering or invoking or explaining. You think religion came with temples? Think again. The first gods were wind and fire. The first prayers were whispers into darkness. The first myths were born in the flicker of torchlight on cave walls, where bison ran across stone and hands pressed pigment like signatures from the soul. And you belonged to this world. You weren't bored. You weren't disconnected. You weren't staring at a screen hoping for dopamine. You were fully present because you had to be. Because survival required all of you. Body, mind, memory, instinct. And every night you laid down beside the fire once more, exhausted. Full, if lucky. Warm, if lucky. Alive until tomorrow. So the question isn't what did cavemen do all day? The question is how did they do it? How did they manage to live without all the things we think we can't survive without? And maybe the bigger question is, what did they have that we've forgotten? Because in the quiet moments when the lights are low and the fire flickers and you lie in bed listening to the wind move outside your window, you might hear it too. The rhythm, the memory. The world they moved through wasn't silent. It creaked and cracked, sang and whispered. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed through tall grass, the rustle of prey echoed off canyon walls. Wind didn't just blow, it carried scent, news, warnings. The land wasn't empty to them, it was full of signs, and reading those signs was survival. You could hear a change in the forest long before you saw it. And you listened, always, because a rustle might be a rabbit, or it might be a lion. You learned fast. Children weren't shielded from this reality. They grew up in it. The idea that childhood was a long, protected bubble of innocence, that's new. Back then, by the time you were 5, you knew how to walk quietly, how to watch adults shape stone, how to carry kindling or follow a forager's footsteps without losing your way. Play and survival weren't separate. Games taught you how to aim a spear, how to balance barefoot on a log, how to mimic the sound of an owl. Tag wasn't just fun, it was rehearsal for escape. And when the sun dipped, when dusk felt like a hush across the trees, you were back at the hearth, curled into warmth, asking 1,000 questions with your eyes, even if your mouth stayed quiet. Because stories were coming, and stories were sacred. They weren't written down. They lived in memory, carried by voices you trusted. Grandmothers with soft hands and fierce eyes, fathers who sharpened bone while speaking softly about the creature he once faced alone in the snow. These weren't fairy tales, they were maps. They told you where danger lived, what dreams meant, what stars to follow. And over time, they became more than memory. They became identity. You knew who you were because someone told you. You belonged to a place, to a people, to a line that stretched further back than you could count. And the proof wasn't in a document. It was in a carved necklace passed down, in a special mark painted behind your ear during a naming ritual, in the way you were taught to sing to the moon or press your forehead to the bark of an old tree as your ancestors had done. Even in hunger, there was meaning. Not every day brought food. Sometimes you went to bed with a gnawing emptiness in your belly, but even that had its ritual. Fasting wasn't failure, it was endurance, a test, a lesson. Elders might say the body is not always first. You were taught to trust that the land would offer again, that the animals would return, that your own strength wasn't gone, it was simply waiting. And when food did come, it wasn't rushed. It was shared carefully, mindfully. Roasted marrow bones passed from hand to hand. Hot stones placed in baskets to boil roots. Berries crushed into pastes mixed with fat stored in pouches. You learned how to taste without wasting, how to eat with gratitude, not greed. Even silence had its place. There were long stretches, days, even when you barely spoke, not because you were unhappy, but because language was only one tool. A glance, a gesture, the tilt of a head, these were fluencies too. You could walk beside someone all day and feel deeply connected without saying a word. Because connection didn't depend on words. It depended on presence, and presence was constant. You didn't multitask, you didn't scroll, you weren't half here. You were all here, watching, reacting, attuning. When a hawk screeched overhead, you looked up together. When rain whispered through trees, you tilted your head at the same moment. When someone coughed differently than usual, you noticed. You always noticed. And when someone was lost, you felt it before you knew it. Grief was a communal thing. It didn't get buried under politeness. It was loud or soft or both. Some wailed. Some went quiet for days. Some painted their faces or cut their hair or walked into the forest alone to speak with the dead. Because the dead weren't gone. Not entirely. They lingered in the places they touched, in a favorite sitting spot near the river, in the crack of a fire, in a certain type of dream. Death wasn't the end of usefulness. It was the beginning of memory. You still asked them for guidance. You still felt them nearby. And in this world of hardship and holiness, even sleep had a rhythm. It wasn't like ours today. No A-tower blocks. No blackout curtains. No clocks. Sleep came in waves. You dozed early, rose again, watched the fire, maybe whispered with someone else who couldn't quite sleep. Then another nap. Then dawn. And in the in-between hours, dreams flowed freely. Dreams weren't ignored or dismissed. They were messages, warnings, symbols. You talked about them, asked questions. If someone dreamed of teeth falling out or a wolf standing upright or a flood inside a cave, that meant something. The group gathered. Elders interpreted. Actions might be taken. You might stay put an extra day, or shift camps, or build new charms from bone and string, because why risk it? Survival was already hard enough. You didn't tempt the unseen, and that was the balance always, the seen and the unseen. You lived in the dirt, but your mind danced in the sky. You followed rules, but left room for wonder. You didn't know everything, but you knew that, and so you stayed humble, curious, open. The world didn't revolve around you. You revolved around it. And the world didn't owe you comfort. It offered seasons, cycles, patterns you could learn from if you watched long enough. The way birds flew lower when rain was coming. The way certain flowers only opened after fire. The way animal tracks shifted after a full moon. These were not coincidences. They were truths, written not in ink, but in mud and shadow and sky. And truth in this world was earned. It wasn't handed down by a textbook or written on a screen. It was tested in your own blood. You learned what not to eat because someone once got sick. You avoided certain caves because something once didn't come back out. Knowledge wasn't abstract. It was intimate, and it came with scars. And with that knowledge came roles, not titles, not job descriptions, but roles fluid, adaptive, built from instinct and necessity. Maybe you were the one with the quietest feet, so you became the scout. Maybe your hands were steady, so you learned to carve needles from bone. Maybe you had a knack for finding birds' nests tucked between branches. Or maybe you were the one people sat beside when they were afraid, because you listened without interruption. There were no promotions, just purpose. And that purpose changed as your body did. When you were young, you ran, you hauled, you carried wood, climbed trees, stayed up to keep watch. But when your joints stiffened and your back ached, you weren't discarded. You became the memory keeper, the healer, the one who had seen what the young hadn't yet survived. You spoke fewer words, but when you did, people leaned in. Because age didn't mean decline, it meant authority. Even blindness didn't take you out of the circle. You could still hum old melodies that kept children calm. You could still recognize herbs by smell. You could still feel the shift in wind through your fingertips. Your worth wasn't measured by what you produced, but by what you passed on. And when sickness came, because it always did, it wasn't ignored or hidden. It was tended. Someone brought water. Someone else mashed roots into paste. A child kept the fire fed. The group didn't turn away. They stayed because everyone knew someday they would lie there too. And what mattered wasn't whether you healed. It was whether you were held. There were no hospitals, no formal doctors, but there was care, crafted from generations of plant wisdom and observation. A woman who knew which bark eased fever. A man who carried a pouch of dried moss that slowed bleeding. The body was seen as something sacred, yes, but also stubborn. It wanted to live. And most of the time it did, but not always. There were winters that came too early, springs that came too late, a child gone in the night, a hunter who didn't return, and there was no avoiding the pain of that. No distraction, no busying yourself with noise. You grieved with your whole chest. You wept until your ribs ached. You screamed into rivers. And then you sang, low, rhythmic, repetitive. The way a lullaby rises from loss. You sang not just to remember, but to remind the others, we are still here. You painted your faces with ash. You braided the names of the dead into your hair. You carved symbols into wood and tied them to branches, letting wind carry the memory. Because forgetting was the only real death. And that's why art existed. Not for museums, but for memory. You painted with ochre and charcoal on cave walls, not to decorate, but to warn, to teach, to witness. The shape of a hand, the arc of a bison, the spiral of stars. All placed with care by someone who knew the story would outlive them. And when you sat in front of that wall decades later, tracing a faded line with your fingertip, you were not just looking at a picture, you were touching a voice. Because art in that world was not separate from life, it was woven into it. Songs were not performances, they were survival instructions. Dance was not entertainment, it was preparation for war. Paint was not vanity, it was power. You didn't own anything, but you carried everything. Your knife, tied at your hip with sinew. Your pouch of flint and fiber. A shell from your grandmother, smooth from generations of thumbs. A bit of fur for warmth. A dried leaf folded into a prayer. You didn't collect things to show off. You carried what mattered. And what mattered was what kept you alive or connected. Because at the end of the day, all you had was each other. That's why circles formed around fires. Why stories were told even when the body begged for sleep. Why you reached for another's shoulder in the dark just to feel the shape of someone breathing beside you. And no one slept alone unless they wanted to. Even in silence, someone was listening. Even in darkness, someone was watching. The world may have been brutal, but so was your tenderness. When the stars blinked open, scattered across the night sky like embers tossed from a cosmic fire, you looked up, not to name constellations, but to feel them. No calendars, no clocks, just the rhythm of the heavens. You knew when to plant because the moon told you. You knew when the animals would move because the air changed. And you could tell the difference between the breath of spring and the sigh of autumn just by how it touched your skin at dusk. The sky was not just a ceiling, it was a teacher. And the fire beneath it, that was your hearth, your light, your center. It crackled like a voice telling old truths. Around that flame, nothing was random. The seating order meant something. the oldest near the fire's warmth, the children pressed against parents, the newest among you just outside the circle listening before speaking, because in that world speaking wasn't a right, it was a responsibility. And when you did speak, you didn't waste breath on what didn't matter. You told stories of animals tricked and heroes humbled, of rivers that healed and mountains that punished. You wrapped meaning in metaphor because sometimes truth needed a softer face. A story could hold a warning or a blessing or both. And when someone shared a dream, you didn't scoff. You listened because maybe it wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was a message. Maybe the ancestors were whispering again, reminding you that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than we pretend. You didn't fear the dark. You respected it because it remembered everything. That's why when someone died, you didn't just bury them and move on. You sang them across. You placed their favorite item beside them, a carved pendant, a smooth stone, a strip of cloth still scented with smoke. You didn't do this out of habit. You did it so they wouldn't feel forgotten, and so you wouldn't forget yourself, because identity wasn't written down, it was worn, it was sung. It was remembered, not with records, but with repetition. That's why names were passed down. That's why certain trees were never cut. That's why stories were told over and over again, even when everyone knew how they ended. Repetition was reverence. It was how you kept the circle unbroken. And circles were everything, not just in the fire pit, but in your walk through the seasons, in the way you return to old paths, in the rhythm of work and rest, hunt and feast, birth and death. There were no straight lines, no ladders, no upward march toward progress. There was only return, and each return brought wisdom. You might notice a plant you missed last time, a crack in the rock that hadn't been there, a shift in your own hands, less firm perhaps, but more careful. You weren't the same person walking the same trail. You were older now, quieter, but more aware. And in that awareness, you found something rare, grace. Not the kind that comes from gods or temples, but the kind that lives in acceptance. In knowing the world owes you nothing and giving thanks anyway. In waking up sore, cold, and hungry, but still finding the breath to say, "I'm here." That was enough. You didn't need to be special. You just needed to belong. And you did belong, not to an ideology, not to a nation, but to a land, a river, a tree line, a ridge where the wind always whistled a certain way. The land didn't have to love you back, it simply had to hold you. And it did. It cradled your dead. It fed your fire. It marked your passing with the quiet patience only stone can manage. And when a child ran laughing across the same meadow where someone once fell in battle, no one stopped them, because that too was grace. Life returning, the circle turning again. You honored the past, but you did not cling to it. You let it breathe, because holding on too tightly was not your way. You had no vaults, no written archives. Your wisdom lived in people, and people changed. So your stories changed too. Not because truth became untrue, but because truth had more faces than you could ever carve into a wall. And some truths were sung better than spoken. So you sang, softly sometimes, loudly when the sky opened with rain. You sang while working, while walking, while weeping. Because music wasn't for entertainment, it was for memory, for movement, for stitching the moment into something eternal, even if no one else heard it. Even if it was just you and the wind, even if your voice cracked with age, you still sang, because somewhere across the valley someone else was singing too. Maybe not the same words, but the same ache, the same hope, the same deep pull of being alive in a world that never guaranteed anything, yet gave you everything if you knew how to see it. And that was the secret, wasn't it? You didn't own the world, you witnessed it. You partnered with it. You gave as much as you took because that was balance. That was survival. That was what your bones understood long before your brain did. And when night came, you didn't resist it. You laid down, head to earth, the pulse of the planet whispering beneath you, and you let it all go. Because tomorrow, you'd need your strength. When the morning came, you didn't leap from sleep like a machine starting up. You stirred, gently like a leaf on still water. Because waking wasn't just about opening your eyes, it was about reconnecting. Remembering where you were, who you were, and what the day would ask of you. You didn't have an alarm clock. You had birdsong. You had the slow stretch of light crawling down the trees, slipping over the horizon like honey poured on stone. You had the quiet shifting of bodies around you, a brother scratching his beard, a child curling closer, an old woman muttering her dreams to the dirt. Waking was a communal thing. You weren't alone in it, and you didn't rush it, because time back then wasn't a taskmaster. It didn't shout in your face or blink from a glowing screen. It passed like a breeze, felt more than seen, marked by shadows and stomachs, by the soft folding of the day into its purpose. And that purpose, it was never just one thing. Some mornings you tracked, following hoofprints so faint they looked like questions in the dust. You moved with the patience of someone who knew the animal owed you nothing, that food wasn't promised, only invited by skill, luck, and the way your breath mingled with the wind. Other mornings you stayed. You napped stone with your hands. You twisted sinew into cord. You checked the traps. You mended your cloak. You taught the little ones how to feel for ripeness without crushing the fruit. There was no such thing as being unproductive, because being was enough. Your presence mattered. Your stillness mattered. Your ability to notice a broken twig, a shifting wind, a bird going silent, it mattered. Attention was your currency. Observation your survival. You didn't scroll to see the world. You read it. And in reading it, you became part of its grammar. You knew the mood of the soil. You sensed the reluctance of water to rise. You didn't have a thermometer, but you could tell the season was changing by the sound of your own footsteps. That kind of knowing doesn't come from books. It comes from bone. It comes from repetition. From generations watching, failing, remembering, whispering. You didn't invent fire, you inherited it. And every time you lit a flame, it wasn't just to cook. It was to continue. A chain passed from hand to hand, spark to spark, across time. And so the day stretched forward. You didn't count the hours, you felt the hunger. You watched how the sun curved over your shoulder. And when it was time, you ate. Not alone, not in silence, but together, and the food. It wasn't plated with garnish or cataloged for macros. It was what you'd found, what you'd earned, what you'd honored. A roasted root. A sliver of dried meat, berries tart and stubborn, maybe fish if the net had been kind, maybe nothing if the land said not today. You chewed with reverence, because even the smallest bite was a story, a chase, a struggle, a memory, and afterward you didn't just discard the bones, you placed them carefully, you gave thanks, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in the way your hand rested on the earth. Because gratitude wasn't performative, it was instinctual. It kept you human. And then came the middle of the day, a time not for rush, but for rhythm, for sharpening tools, tending wounds, weaving, watching. The children played, their laughter not just tolerated, but treasured. Because it meant life went on. And the elders, they sat in the shade and told stories, not because they were old, but because they knew. And knowledge wasn't data. It was intimacy with the land, with the sky, with loss and love and the ache of watching your own fingers wrinkle like the bark of the trees you grew up under. You respected the elders not because they had power, but because they lasted. And to last in a world like that, a world without cushions or conveniences, was no small miracle. So when they spoke, you listened. because their words had outlived storms. And if the weather turned, if the wind curled with warning, if the sky thickened, you didn't panic. You read it, you adjusted, you gathered. You leaned into the strength of community, of practice, of the quiet understanding that survival was never solo. And when the rain came, you didn't curse it, you welcomed it, because thirst is humbling, and the sound of water on leaves is a lullaby older than language. You rested when you could, you worked when you must. But in all things you carried a kind of grace, not the showy kind, not the delicate kind, but the kind built from dirt under your nails and a horizon line etched into your soul. When the light began to tilt, you noticed. Not because a clock told you, not because a screen dimmed, but because the shadows started to stretch like sleepy animals. Because the air changed cooler now with a hush that made even the trees stand a little quieter. Evening didn't announce itself. It arrived, soft as a whisper, and you answered it the way your ancestors always had, by slowing down, by checking in, by gathering, because that's what you did when the day curled inward. You gathered. Wood for the fire, water for the night. People, too, the ones you'd spent the day walking beside but hadn't spoken to since sunrise. It was strange how being together in silence could still make you miss someone. But you did. And so you came back to the fire, always the fire. It wasn't just warmth. It was memory. It was safety. It was language before language. Sparks rising into the sky like thoughts too shy to speak. The smoke curling like an arm around your shoulders. The glow painting your face with a kind of ancient honesty. Around that fire no one performed. You just were. You might have cooked again, not because you were hungry, but because warmth meant comfort, and comfort was rare enough to be sacred. You roasted roots you knew by touch. You turned meat on sticks, humming something wordless. You shared what you had because back then hoarding wasn't power, it was fear. And fear made you smaller, but generosity, that made you remembered. And after the food came the stories. Always. Because stories weren't entertainment, they were infrastructure. They held the shape of the world in your mouth. They warned, explained, remembered. They turned pain into guidance. They wrapped tragedy in rhythm. They named the stars and gave meaning to the rustling in the reeds. You didn't ask, is it true? You asked, what does it teach? Sometimes the story was about a giant who swallowed moons. Sometimes it was about the girl who ran faster than the wind, who could hear roots speak. Sometimes it was about your own grandmother, who once tracked a wounded boar for 2 days and brought it home in a storm with nothing but a knife and a prayer. And you believed all of it, because truth wasn't always factual, it was felt. And what you felt around that fire wasn't fiction, it was connection, it was inheritance. It was proof that even though the world was dangerous, strange, and full of endings, you weren't facing it alone. You had stories, you had each other, and that meant you had everything. The children would fight sleep always, because the fire made the darkness feel alive. And who wanted to miss the flicker of an old man's eyes as he leaned in to whisper the forbidden part of the tale? Who wanted to miss the laughter, the gasps, the way someone always claimed they heard footsteps just beyond the tree line? But eventually the children would curl close, heads in laps, fingers in hair, breathing slowing to the rhythm of coals settling. And the adults would go quiet too, because after a day like that, what was left to say? You had loved, you had worked, you had fed and fought and noticed the sky, and now you were tired. Not the kind of tired we know today, the kind that comes from noise and urgency and decision fatigue. This was earned tired, bone deep, clean. And so you'd stretch out near the fire or crawl into the shelter your hands had built, leaves above and fur below, and you'd close your eyes, not afraid of the dark, Not anymore, because you'd made peace with it, because you knew the night, knew its voice, knew how to walk through it and still come back whole. And if a wolf howled, you listened. If the wind shifted, you noted it, but mostly you slept. You slept the way trees sleep, with trust, with stillness, with roots that went deeper than fear. And in your dreams, you might have run with the animals you couldn't catch in daylight. You might have seen the faces of those long buried. You might have heard a story not yet told and remembered it so clearly you'd wake with the urge to share it before the dawn peeled open the world again. When the first crack of morning split the sky, it wasn't with fanfare. No alarms, no urgent buzzing from some machine on the bedside table, just a bird, just a breeze, just the way cold air touches your cheek when the sun decides it's time. You didn't rise because you had to. You rose because the world did. The fire, now just glowing ash, reminded you that life moved in cycles. Flame to ember, ember to smoke, smoke to memory. You stirred from your nest leaves, fur, woven grasses, or maybe just earth still holding the warmth of your body. You blinked at the soft gray light, and for a moment you listened, because morning had its own language. A silence that wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, with decision, with breath. You stretched not because a yoga class told you to, but because your body asked for it. Your back arched like a cat's. Your arms reached for a sky you couldn't yet see. And your feet, bare or wrapped in hide, tested the earth for mood. Was it damp? Was it cold? Was it angry? You could tell. You always could. Before teeth were brushed or phones checked or tasks assigned, you checked the sky, the wind, the birds. You asked the day with your skin what kind of guest it would be. And then slowly the others stirred too. The tribe, your people, faces you'd seen every day since you were born, faces you trusted to stand beside you when the wolves came, faces you sometimes fought with, sometimes wept beside, but always returned to. The first conversations of the day weren't words. They were grunts, smiles, shared glances, a hand to the shoulder, a nod toward the horizon. Everyone knew what needed to happen. There were no to-do lists, no emails marked urgent, but the work was waiting just the same. One by one, people moved toward it, some to gather, some to hunt, some to tend the fire or clean the tools. Children were given tasks too, not out of cruelty, but out of dignity. Everyone had a role, everyone belonged. You might have walked to the river, your breath hanging like mist, the sun still flirting with the treetops. There you'd wash, not in hot water, not with fragrant soap, but with cold truth. The truth of being alive, the shock of it, the reminder that you were animal, body, blood, and bone. And that the world didn't owe you warmth, you had to earn it. So you scrubbed. You cupped water in your hands. You watched it fall back over and over like a tiny ritual. A baptism not of sin, but of survival. You didn't look in mirrors. You looked in the eyes of your people to see who you were, and they saw you. Not the wrinkles, not the blemishes, not the pounds gained or lost. They saw your spirit. They saw the way you ran through storms, the way you held your breath when you tracked deer, the way you hummed old songs to calm the babies. You were enough, already, and then breakfast, if you could call it that. No menus, no options, just whatever the world had offered up and whatever you had the skill to keep. Maybe it was roasted tubers blackened at the edges. Maybe it was dried meat torn and chewed with gratitude. Maybe it was berries, nuts, a stolen egg. Food wasn't a choice. It was a reminder that yesterday you'd done well enough to see today. And around that meal, the day began again. Plans were made not in speeches, but in glances. Two of you would check the traps. One would carve new arrows. The elders would sit, not because they were weak, but because their minds were now the strongest tool you had. They remembered things you hadn't lived, like where the deer disappeared when the wind blew east, or how to tell if a storm would crack the sky or just pass with a grumble, or which plants helped a fever and which ones could kill. You listened to them, not out of obligation, but out of survival, because in a world without Google, memory was the library, and wisdom was life insurance. So the day rolled forward, full of movement, full of purpose, full of small triumphs and quiet hurts. A new scrape on your leg from a branch you didn't see, a shout of joy when a fish was caught with bare hands. A moment of stillness when you realized this was it. This was life. Not waiting for the weekend, not aiming for retirement, just living, one fire, one footstep, one story at a time. By mid-morning, the air had warmed just enough to loosen the joints. You didn't stretch because a fitness coach said so. You stretched because your body had already earned it. Your arms ached from the firewood. Your back tightened from the cold. But you moved through it anyway, like bark shifting on a living tree. And then came the walk, not for leisure, not for steps on a pedometer, but for food, for clues, for knowledge. Out into the thicket, bare feet pressed into mud still wet from last night's rain. Or maybe you had wrapped them in scraps of hide, stiffened from use, softened by time. Every step had meaning, every sound a message. The rustle of a bird wasn't just background noise, it was a signal. The broken twig underfoot wasn't just clutter, it was a clue. You walked the same paths every season, yet never the same way twice. The forest was never static. It changed like the wind, like a face aged by sun and storms. And you learned to read it like scripture. You knew which mushrooms whispered death and which ones sang life. You knew the difference between fresh claw marks and old. You knew how to walk with silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness. Sometimes you walked alone, other times with a companion, a sibling, a friend, a child not yet old enough to understand but curious enough to follow. You didn't give lectures, you showed, you guided, you let them ask questions with their eyes. And maybe that day the gods were kind. A rabbit, a bird, a cluster of honey in a tree hollow. You whispered thanks under your breath. Or maybe you sang it, a wordless hum passed down through your ancestors, shaped more by feeling than grammar. You didn't take more than you needed, and you left something behind, a gesture, a prayer, a sliver of meat for the spirits. Because even then, even with dirt under your nails and hunger in your gut, you believed the earth was alive. Not just matter, but meaning. Not just ground, but grandmother. You returned not with bags, not with bulging baskets, but with enough. Enough to fill a stomach. Enough to share. Enough to survive. And when you returned, the village, if you could call it that, greeted you not with applause, but with eyes that lit up. A nod, a smile, a fire rekindled. Small things meant everything. A sharp tool, a warm stone, a reed basket that held just a little more than expected. Children circled around the fire, poking it with sticks, imagining dragons or giants. You might have joined them, told a tale that wasn't quite true, or maybe it was, depending on who you asked. The sky turned gold. Not because it was time for golden hour, but because that's how the world announced its slow descent into evening. No need for clocks. Your body knew, the shadows stretched. The birds sang a little softer. The work began to slow, and you gathered together again, not for show, not for productivity, but because it was what humans did. We gather, we circle. We bring our stories and our scraps and our scars to the same flame. You sat, cross-legged on the ground, or leaning on a rock, or cradling a child who still smelled like smoke and milk and tomorrow. You chewed slowly, the meat tough but rich, the roots boiled, softened by fire. There was no seasoning unless you counted ash and memory, And maybe you spoke, or maybe you didn't have to, because in the flicker of the flames, in the crackle of dry wood surrendering to heat, you already understood each other. Maybe someone sang, maybe someone carved, maybe someone stared into the fire, eyes glazed not from sleep but from thinking. Because even then, even after all that labor, all that movement, your mind didn't stop. It wandered, it remembered, it wondered. Where do the stars go in the day? Why do dreams feel like truth? Will the baby survive the winter? You didn't have answers, you had stories, and you passed them down, not because you thought they were factual, but because they carried something more important, a feeling, a shape, a sense of how to live. And that was enough. Some nights, the stories were heavy. Not all myths were for laughter. Some carved themselves out of real grief, of a brother who never came back, of a mother who bled too long, of a fire that devoured not just food but memory. And around that fire, in those quiet twilight moments, the line between fact and legend didn't matter. A shadow seen once on the ridge became the tale of the mountain god who watches over wanderers. A strange birthmark was said to be the kiss of a star, proof that a child carried the voice of the sky. You told these stories because they made sense of what didn't. They gave shape to fear. They gave rhythm to chaos. They let you feel like something out there cared or at least noticed. And when children asked questions that pierced too deeply, why did my sister go cold? Or why do we get hungry even when we work hard? The answer wasn't a lecture. It was a song, a parable, a dream someone once had under the blood moon. Because when survival is your daily art form, explanation becomes poetry. And if poetry fails, you lean into silence. There's wisdom in not answering everything. The fire crackled on. Sometimes you stayed up late sharpening tools or mending a tunic. Other times, sleep crept in like a cat curling around your bones before you noticed it was there. You didn't sleep in perfect darkness. The moon watched you. The wind whispered through gaps in the walls. Your dreams weren't always kind, but you slept. Because sleep in that world wasn't optional. It was sacred. Your body needed it to fight again, walk again, gather again, love again. No mattress, no alarm clock, no white noise machine, just the cold kiss of stone, the warm nuzzle of fur, the heartbeat of your own chest ticking against the floor of the world. And when you woke, it wasn't with a phone in your hand. It was with breath. With the ache of muscles reminded they exist, with a faint sense that the dream you had meant something, but you'd never quite recall what. The sun returned, as it always did, whether you were ready or not, and you rose, not because you felt rested, but because that's what living demanded. You stoked the coals. You nudged your children or your partner or your elder still wrapped in sleep. You stepped out into the damp breath of morning, and once again you began the work of being alive. Another walk, another route to find, another child to calm, another moment of noticing the quiet miracle that you were still here, still breathing, still making sense of the world, one fire, one story, one choice at a time. And maybe someday someone would tell your story, maybe not in books, maybe not with your name, but in the way they held a child gently, in the way they watched the stars not for answers but for peace, in the way they spoke of the old days not as something to mock but something to remember. Because long before we had language for it, we were already historians, not with ink but with bone, not with parchment but with firelight. And even now, headphones on, screen glowing, the modern world humming outside your window, a part of you still remembers, still listens, still wonders. Because maybe we haven't changed all that much. We're still just people searching the woods for meaning, circling back to the fire, trying to turn our lives into stories worth passing on. And so the day begins again. Only this time it's not the Paleolithic forest, and it's not mammoth hides or birch bark in your hands. It's plastic keyboards, coffee mugs, electric lights humming in the ceiling. But underneath all that, underneath the denim and deadlines, you're still carrying the same bones, the same brain, the same need. Because the truth is, our modern mornings are built on ancient rhythms. You still wake up chasing warmth, even if it's from a heated blanket instead of a fire. You still stretch like a hunter, not for a spear, but maybe for a phone or a robe or a quiet moment of peace before the noise rushes in. And you still listen, if not to wind in the trees, then maybe to music, or to your own thoughts as they flicker past like shadows in the cave. We've traded mammoth hunts for morning traffic, berry picking for scrolling emails. But the internal pulse, that drumbeat of survival, of connection, of ritual, it's still with us. The caveman didn't just die out. He moved in. He lives in your craving for meaning, in your irritation when someone interrupts your morning pattern, in the way your shoulders ease when someone builds you a cup of tea the way you like it, just the way someone might have once roasted roots in your favorite way over a shared fire. And all those ancient fears, they've adapted too. You don't fear saber-toothed cats anymore, but you might still feel that gut twist, that cortisol surge, when a boss sends a vague email, or when the rent creeps up, or when a siren wails too long in the distance. It's the same brain, it's the same body, just reskinned with Wi-Fi and Google Maps. And while your day might include spreadsheets or childcare or building something beautiful with your hands, part of you is still walking through the same invisible forest, still scanning for danger, still wondering who in the tribe is safe to trust, still hoping someone will save you a piece of the good meat at the end of the day. The stories you tell yourself about who you are, about what matters, those are your cave paintings now. Your digital footprints are just newer versions of ochre handprints on a stone wall. And every now and then, something ancient still slips through. It's why you pause when someone tells you a story that feels true, even if you can't explain why. It's why you lean in when someone speaks in a tone that sounds like the old tales, like firelight and truth and sorrow all woven into one. It's why, even now, you might find yourself standing still in the middle of a crowded grocery store aisle, staring at a stranger's eyes, and thinking, you've lived a whole life I'll never know. That's the echo. That's the bone-deep knowing that all of this, everything we build and break and try again, is still one long human story. Still a survival tale, still a myth in progress, still firelight flickering on our faces, even if we don't sit around the flames anymore. So maybe, just maybe, you can forgive yourself a little today, for the things you don't finish, for the tools you still haven't mastered, for the fear you haven't tamed. You're not broken, you're just ancient, and you're still learning to live in a world your ancestors could never have imagined. But if they could see you now through the fog of centuries, they might not scold your slow mornings or your soft hands. They might just smile, because you made it. You're still here, still rising, still human. And when the sun goes down tonight and you're folding into the hush of evening again, remember, that's not just sleep you're walking toward. It's ritual, it's renewal. It's the oldest part of you whispering, good work today, come back to the fire. And so we return to the flicker of flame, not on a cave wall, but maybe on a bedside candle or the blue glow of a screen dimmed low. Still, the ritual holds, because even in the 21st century, our descent into sleep carries the bones of something ancient. You don't just lie down to rest. You return to the cave. Back then, sleep wasn't a luxury, it was survival. To lie still in the dark meant trusting your tribe, trusting that someone would keep watch, that no beasts would come creeping through the grass, no rival clan with sharpened flint. That fear never fully left us. Why else do we double-check the locks before bed? Why do we curl under layers even when the room is warm? It's not just about comfort. It's about safety. An echo of a time when every rustle in the dark might have meant the end. And yet our ancestors still dreamed. Dreams were not idle things. They were warnings, prophecies, messages from gods or ghosts or the unseen energies that wove through the forest. A dream could change your role in the tribe. A vision could send you into exile or raise you as a shaman. Sleep wasn't escape. It was communication with the hidden layers of the world. Today we call them REM cycles and neural firings, but the feeling remains. That strange tug when a dream feels too real. When you wake with tears on your cheeks and can't explain why. When you hear the voice of someone long gone and swear they were trying to tell you something. That's not just the brain, that's the bloodline. The ancestors, whispering through the folds of your unconscious, reminding you that you're still connected to something deeper than memory. And the body remembers too. We think we invented bedtime routines, warm drinks, soft lighting, winding down from the day, but really, we're just modern monks repeating ancient rituals. Thousands of years ago, people rubbed oils into their skin, chanted prayers into the dusk, arranged their sleeping spaces with intention. A bed wasn't just for sleeping, it was a shrine to restoration. Even now, you probably have little habits you don't think about. The way you fold your blanket, the side of the bed you choose, the final thing you check before sleep, the stove, the door, the phone. These aren't quirks, they're spell work, little protections. The modern version of placing dried herbs by the fire pit or painting symbols on the rock above your head. You don't just go to sleep, you descend into a place where the thinking mind loosens and something older, something animal takes over. Where you don't just rest, you regenerate. Where your body, that strange miracle of meat and memory, begins to stitch itself back together hormone by hormone, cell by cell. You dream and your bones repair. You dream and your heart slows. You dream and somewhere deep down your story recalibrates. You might not remember the dreams, most people don't, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. They were just written in a language too old for words, carved in instinct, etched in breath, spoken in symbols like the first cave art, a handprint, a stag, a spiral, things we still don't fully understand, and maybe aren't meant to. And in this in-between space, this threshold between the day's end and the soul's wandering, you join every human who's ever lived. The mother who wrapped her baby in furs and hummed it to sleep. The old man who watched the stars flicker one last time before closing his eyes. The boy who fell asleep to the sound of waves crashing against the cliff, dreaming of gods he couldn't name. You are not alone in this night. You're surrounded by echoes, carried by a lineage of sleepers, stretching back through ice and stone and fire. The fire might be out, the room might be dark, but the stories aren't done yet. Because while your body sleeps, your mind keeps moving, drifting through landscapes not bound by logic or time. And here's the truth most people forget. Even in our most vulnerable moments, we are explorers, dreamers, time travelers without maps. And that has always been true, long before alarm clocks and mattresses and melatonin pills. Let's go back again, not just to the caves, but to the fields, the huts, the ships rocking under starlit skies. Have you ever wondered how a sailor slept? Not curled in a cozy bed, but tucked into a hammock, swaying with every wave, listening to creaks and groans and gulls outside. The sea never truly sleeps. And neither did they. Sailors had to rest in shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, a cycle that warped time and bent the body's natural rhythm into something rough and salt-soaked. Still, they slept, because they had to, because the body demands it even when the world refuses to stop. Or think of the medieval baker, rising before the sun, before the roosters, before the bells of morning prayer. He didn't sleep through the night. He napped in strange windows, an hour here, another after the loaves were done. That kind of fractured sleep used to be common. It had a name, segmented sleep. People would sleep in 2 chunks, first sleep and second sleep, with a quiet hour or 2 in between. A time to pray, to write, to reflect, or maybe just to sit under the stars in silence. We've forgotten that rhythm. We chase 8 straight hours like it's the Holy Grail, but our ancestors didn't. They listened to their bodies. They moved with the seasons. In the winter, when nights stretched long and cold, they might sleep 10 or 12 hours, wrapped in furs, waking only to add logs to the fire. In the summer, sleep was shorter, lighter, interrupted by birdsong or the sweat of dawn. Rest wasn't about strict hours. It was about survival, harmony, and listening, something we've mostly unlearned, and yet, something inside you still remembers. That's why a midday nap can feel so sacred, why a sudden wave of sleep in the afternoon sun can knock you out so completely. It's not laziness, it's ancient, it's primal, it's your body remembering how to rest when it needs to. Even animals know this. Dogs curl into themselves. Birds fluff their feathers. Bears surrender to months of stillness. We call it hibernation, but isn't that just a deeper kind of letting go? Now imagine this. A Roman senator draped in his toga nodding off during a midday speech. Not because he was bored, but because the heat and the wine and the long, slow rhythm of the day made resistance impossible. Sleep back then wasn't shameful. It was expected. In fact, the Latin word for noon rest, meridiatio, was a respected part of daily life. Entire cities slowed down in the heat. Shops closed. People rested. Today, we fight against it. We load up on caffeine. We stare at screens until our brains are fried. We pretend we're machines, but we're not. We are animals, and animals sleep, not because they are weak, but because they are wise, because to sleep is to heal. To dream is to recalibrate. To rest is to return to yourself, to your ancestors, to the rhythm that held humanity together long before we had electric light or streaming content. So tonight, when your head hits the pillow, don't fight it. Don't scroll one more time. Don't push through. Let go, sink in. Because while your body might be tired, your soul, that old ancient thing, is just getting ready for its journey. You might wake in a few hours and not remember where you went. But that's okay. The important things don't always leave footprints. They leave echoes. So here we are again, still, quiet, wrapped in the hush that only night knows how to hold. Let's take another step back, not into the distant Paleolithic this time, but into the dim corners of a medieval village, or maybe a cluttered Renaissance workshop. Somewhere candlelight flickers, ink dries, and behind thick shutters someone dreams. Because sleep, through all its shifting forms, wasn't just survival, it was sacred. For the monks of the 13th century, sleep was a battleground between the holy and the sinful. They didn't aim for restfulness, but for vigilance. Their nights were broken deliberately. They rose in the middle of the night for matins, midnight prayers whispered in cold chapels, voices echoing under stone arches. To sleep too deeply was to be spiritually lazy, so they denied themselves rest, believing that fatigue purified the soul. Now contrast that with the nobility, those who slept not in straw or hay, but in towering feather beds raised off the ground. Beds with thick curtains, not just to keep out cold, but to keep in secrets. To sleep well for the rich was not a spiritual duty, it was performance, prestige, status. You had a servant to stoke your fire, another to warm your sheets with stones, maybe even someone to watch you while you slept for safety or scandal or both. And yet, in every corner of society, no matter the class, there was one shared fear: what dreams might bring. Because dreams weren't seen as random. They were omens, messages, warnings. Sometimes they were blamed on indigestion, other times on sin, but more often they were thought to be divine or demonic. A woman dreaming of water might be told she was about to give birth. A man dreaming of a snake could wake fearing betrayal. People kept dream books under their pillows filled with symbols and meanings. A crow meant bad luck. A lamb meant peace. A fall from a tower, best stay away from high places. But not all dreams came in sleep. Some came with the help of herbs. Have you heard of mandrake? Its roots shaped like a tiny man, it was said to scream when pulled from the earth. Used carefully, it could send someone into a deep, hallucinated sleep. Used carelessly, it could kill. Then there was valerian, used to calm the nerves. Poppy syrup, harvested from opium pods, dulled pain and induced heavy sleep. Even mugwort, named after Artemis herself, was burned as incense to invite prophetic dreams. Our ancestors didn't separate sleep from the mystical. They believed the veil between worlds was thinnest when the body lay still, and maybe they were right. Because have you ever woken from a dream that felt more real than your waking life? A place you swear you've been before, a face you know you've never seen. What if those aren't just tricks of the brain? What if that's the memory of something older, something buried deep in the bones? Even the architecture of sleep has shifted. For most of human history, people didn't sleep in private. Peasants shared beds. Families piled in together. Inns rented space by the spot, not the room. You might sleep next to a stranger, head to toe, grateful just to be warm. Privacy, like silence, was a luxury. And darkness, that was real. No street lamps, no phone glow. Just the moon, the stars, and maybe the orange flicker of firelight. In that kind of darkness, sleep didn't need to be chased. It came on its own, slow, enveloping, full of shadow and breath. And when the rooster crowed, or the bell rang, or the baby cried, they rose. Not refreshed necessarily, but renewed. Tied still to that ancient rhythm. We've lost so much of that now. We sleep alone in quiet, climate-controlled boxes under weighted blankets with apps and white noise and pills. And yet we struggle more than ever to feel rested. Maybe because we're trying too hard. Sleep isn't a task, it's a return. A soft spiral back to the place where you don't have to be anything. Not productive, not perfect. Just present, just human. And if you let it, tonight might be the night you remember how. Still with me. Imagine this. The fire has long since burned down to embers. Your body, once coiled in motion and obligation, is finally still. And the night doesn't press in on you like fear. It cradles you like memory, like something older than language, older than time. That's the place where sleep used to begin. Not in a rush to recharge, not in a panic to perform again tomorrow, but in surrender, in silence, in trust. And now maybe we're ready to return to that. Let's drift back once more, to the beginning, not just of sleep, but of sight. Because the human story isn't only about fire and shelter and survival, it's also about seeing, not just with our eyes, but with our minds. But even that at times required help. So let's talk about the quiet invention that changed everything: eyeglasses. They didn't come with fanfare or glory. No great battle was won because of them. No king claimed credit. But for those who once believed their vision, their usefulness, their purpose had ended, eyeglasses whispered, "Not yet." The earliest records trace back to the 13th century. A Dominican friar named Giordano da Pisa once told his congregation that eyeglasses were a new miracle, barely 20 years old at the time. That puts their invention around the 1280s, almost lost to time, like a secret that passed from one hand to another. But imagine the moment. A monk, aging, whose hands still remembered how to scribe, but whose eyes betrayed him. Then someone hands him two curved pieces of glass. He looks through them and the letters return. Clear, steady, holy. That wasn't just vision, it was resurrection. The glassmakers of Venice, especially those on the island of Murano, refined this fragile magic. Masters of clarity and craft, they began shaping lenses that didn't just magnify. They gave people their work, their dignity, their identity back. There were no prescriptions yet. No optometrists. People simply tried on lens after lens until the world sharpened around them. And just like that, aging didn't mean fading. It meant adapting. Monks copied scripture again. Artists returned to delicate detail. Surgeons could once again stitch what mattered. And across Europe, the whispers of this quiet tool began to spread. By the early 1300s, eyeglasses had reached France, Germany, and England. Expensive, yes, but powerful. Literacy began to bloom. Books weren't just read, they were lived. Because with glasses, knowledge didn't end at 40 or 50. It kept going, and so did the people. As towns grew and guilds formed, eyeglasses shifted from monastic luxury to mercantile necessity. Merchants reading contracts, artisans carving patterns, scribes tallying ledgers, all of them needed precision, and eyeglasses delivered. They were crude at first, wire frames, horn-rimmed loupes, nothing like the sleek designs we wear today, but they worked, and that was enough. Then, something seismic happened. Gutenberg, the printing press. Suddenly, books weren't treasures, they were tools. Ideas moved faster, literacy climbed, and with it the demand for eyeglasses exploded. By the 15th century, glasses were being sold by peddlers in the streets, in apothecaries, even in early department stalls. You didn't need a monastery to see again, just a coin and hope. And maybe that's when something subtle began to shift. Because glasses didn't just help people see, they began to help people be seen. At first, they were marks of wisdom. Saints and scholars in paintings, haloed by gold, spectacles perched on their noses. But as the middle class rose, glasses became markers of education, of professionalism, of quiet, intelligent ambition. No longer cloistered tools of the elite, spectacles became democratic, ordinary, and revolutionary in that very ordinariness. Because what is more radical than giving someone back the world? And yet, this was only the beginning. Next, we'll step into an age of science and rebellion, an era of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, when seeing clearly meant questioning everything. So here we are. Not in a dusty library, not in a Venetian glass shop, not under candlelight scribbling Latin manuscripts, but still in a story about vision. A story about how humans refuse to accept the blur, refuse to let time or biology erase the words, the art, the stars. Because when the 17th century dawned, the question changed. It was no longer, how can I see again? It became, what is sight? Enter Galileo, Kepler, Newton. These weren't just scientists. They were revolutionaries with lenses. They didn't only want to help people read. They wanted to understand why reading became hard in the first place. They wanted to break down the physics behind seeing, behind light, behind reality. Johannes Kepler was the first to explain it with mathematical clarity. Around 1604, he showed that nearsightedness and farsightedness were not random afflictions. They were optical problems. Curves, angles, refracted light. Suddenly, lenses weren't just lucky guesses at the marketplace. They were tools that could be designed, predicted, improved. This changed everything. It meant the old trial and error method, trying on one lens after another like shoes at a market, was giving way to something precise, scientific, personal. And meanwhile, Galileo, he took those same principles and lifted our gaze to the stars. He didn't invent the telescope, but he reimagined it. Using refined lenses, he magnified the heavens, moons around Jupiter, craters on the moon, proof that Earth wasn't the center of the universe, all from a pair of curved glass lenses stacked in a brass tube. The same optical knowledge that helped a scholar read a book and now let humans read the sky. At the same time, microscopes opened in the other direction. The cell, the unseen, the tiny structures of life that had always been there but now at last visible. Lenses weren't just tools of correction, they were tools of discovery, of defiance, of awe, and that awe began to spread. Eyeglasses themselves evolved too. As the science advanced, so did the craftsmanship. In London, Paris, Amsterdam, artisans began calling themselves opticians. Not just makers, but professionals, experts in a trade now backed by physics, not folklore. Frames started improving slowly. Early models still clamped onto the nose or tied around the head, but now some included tiny hinges. Leather nose pads, short handles called temples. The idea was taking hold. Glasses weren't just for sitting still, they were for living. Meanwhile, across the world in China, frames had already included silk loops around the ears, and Europeans slowly borrowed that idea. Glasses began to stay on the face, not just sit awkwardly above it. And another quiet revolution began. For the first time, nearsighted people, young, alert, observant, were being given lenses too. Until now, glasses mostly corrected presbyopia, the farsightedness of aging. But as knowledge of optics grew, so did awareness of myopia, and that meant children, teenagers, scholars, watchmakers. Anyone whose world was sharp only inches from their face suddenly had access to clarity. No longer was vision correction the realm of the elderly alone. And that perhaps was the most radical shift of all. Because now, seeing wasn't just about restoring the past, it was about empowering the future. By the end of the 1600s, eyeglasses were part of the Enlightenment fabric. Like printing presses and telescopes, they weren't just inventions, they were philosophies. They said, you are not stuck with the limits of your body. You can extend it, correct it, expand it. And isn't that the story of being human? To find where the world blurs and then bend glass until it sharpens again. So what came next? Style, mass production, fame. The 18th century was about to turn eyeglasses into something no one expected, fashion. But before we get there, take a breath. Let the light settle. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine this. A quiet room. A cracked lens on a workbench, a candle flickering over ink-stained hands, and one more pair of eyes anywhere in the world, seeing clearly again for the first time in years. That's the power of a curve in glass. The 18th century opened its doors not just to revolutions and rationalism, but to refinement, to flair, to the subtle art of showing off intelligence with elegance. And eyeglasses, they came along for the ride, no longer just perched on the noses of monks and merchants, but stepping boldly into the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of London, and the royal courts of Europe. Imagine this: candlelit rooms filled with powdered wigs, lace cuffs, and whispered debates on philosophy. A gentleman leans forward, eyes glittering behind round spectacles. A lady lifts a delicate lorgnette to her face, not just to read the poem, but to signal that she has arrived, that she sees clearly, that she belongs. Because now, glasses weren't just about seeing the world. They were about being seen. Around the 1720, a breakthrough quietly reshaped how spectacles were worn. The invention of temple arms, those familiar side pieces that rest over the ears, transformed glasses from something clumsy and temporary into something wearable and secure. For the first time, you could move, laugh, speak, even dance, and your glasses stayed with you. No more tying cords around your head or pinching your nose until it ached. Now you had comfort, stability, and with it came confidence. Frame design blossomed. Glasses weren't just useful, they were stylish. Tortoiseshell, horn, silver, even gold. Some were engraved, others encrusted with tiny jewels. If you were wealthy, you could commission bespoke spectacles as personalized as a pocket watch. And if you weren't, you still had options. Street vendors, apothecaries, traveling peddlers. By the mid-1700, glasses were filtering through every level of society. The Enlightenment had turned reading into a moral virtue, literacy into a public good, and with that came the need, the right, to see clearly. Public figures helped normalize and popularize glasses too. Benjamin Franklin, with his trademark round spectacles, didn't just wear them, he reinvented them. Tired of switching between distance and reading lenses, he devised bifocals. Two lenses split across a single frame, one for near, one for far. A genius move for a man who believed in both practicality and progress. But Franklin wasn't alone. Glasses began popping up in portraits, pamphlets, plays. Writers, scientists, clergy, even fashionable debutantes embraced them. The quizzing glass, basically a monocle with flair, became a popular accessory among the upper class. You didn't even need vision problems to carry one. It was a statement, a spark of mystery, a flirt. And then there was the lorgnette, a foldable pair of spectacles with a handle, popular with aristocratic women who wanted both grace and function. You'd see them flutter open at operas, salons, garden parties. They said, "Yes, I read poetry and I look fabulous doing it." Eyeglasses, in short, had become cultural objects, not just tools of science or religion, but of self-expression. And that cultural tide didn't stop. As the 18th century rolled into the 19th, the Industrial Revolution began humming in the background. Machines spun thread, forged steel, and soon began cutting glass. What had once been handcrafted by guild artisans could now be produced faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers than ever before. Mass production changed everything. Now, glasses weren't rare or reserved, they were accessible. Available in general stores, sent through the mail, sold from catalogs. You didn't need a craftsman or an optician to get a pair. You could try on different lenses, pick the one that helped most, and walk away with clarity. Were they perfectly fitted? No. But were they good enough to read, work live? Absolutely. Frames also diversified. Celluloid and early plastic replaced expensive horn and shell. Steel and nickel became popular. New shapes emerged. Ovals, rectangles, even pince-nez, those nose-pinching styles you see in old political cartoons. Fashion kept evolving just as rapidly as function. And for the first time, children entered the picture. As public education spread and blackboards became part of everyday schooling, more kids began to struggle with reading, not because they couldn't learn, but because they couldn't see. Teachers noticed, parents adapted, and slowly, eyeglasses became part of childhood too. Meanwhile, science continued marching forward. Ophthalmology became a real field. Doctors started to specialize in vision. And in 1862, a German eye doctor named Hermann Snellen introduced something revolutionary: the eye chart. You know the one, big E at the top, rows of letters shrinking downward. For the first time, vision could be measured with standardization. No more guesswork, no more try this, maybe that. You could now be tested, diagnosed, and prescribed with increasing precision. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had changed forever. Factory workers wore glasses, professors wore glasses, children, clerks, travelers, tailors, glasses were everywhere. No longer a curiosity, no longer a luxury, just part of life. A sign not of weakness, but of participation. And the story wasn't even close to done. Because the next century would be one of revolutions, of plastic, of Hollywood, of contacts and computers. A century where glasses didn't just correct vision, they reshaped identity. So close your eyes now just for a moment. Imagine the clink of pince-nez at a Parisian cafe, the glint of gold frames in a candlelit salon, the whisper of silk ribbons brushing the ear as a lady flicks open her lorgnette. Glasses, quietly, gently, were changing how we saw the world, and how the world saw us. So, picture this. We're stepping out of candlelit salons and into the roar of the 20th century. Trains are moving, radios are humming, cities are glowing, and glasses, they're no longer just tucked into the pockets of scholars or perched on the noses of quiet poets. Now they're striding into movie sets, battlefields, jazz clubs, and classrooms. Because the 20th century wasn't just about industry, it was about identity. And glasses, oddly enough, became one of the most personal objects a person could wear. Let's rewind just a bit to the early 1900s. Wire-rimmed glasses were still popular. Think thin, circular, and efficient. Something you'd see on a professor, a clerk, or a curious child leaning over a library desk. But the world was about to get a lot faster, louder, and more expressive. And so were glasses. By the 1920s and 30s, new materials like celluloid and bakelite gave birth to bolder, thicker frames. You could now wear glasses that announced you, that gave your face a shape, a mood, even a voice. Round horn-rimmed glasses, once practical, became iconic thanks to silent film star Harold Lloyd, who flipped the narrative. Suddenly, being the guy with glasses wasn't about looking weak. It was about looking sharp. And the movement caught fire. In the decades that followed, glasses danced in step with the changing culture. During World War II, innovation accelerated. Military demand pushed the development of lenses that were more durable, more lightweight, more versatile. Soldiers were issued standard issue specs, affectionately and mockingly dubbed GI glasses or birth control glasses, which may not have been flattering but were reliable in the trenches. It wasn't glamorous, but it was revolutionary, because when millions of soldiers came home with glasses, it helped normalize them even further. Glasses weren't strange. They were practical, American, strong. And then in 1958, something quietly wonderful happened: plastic lenses. They were lighter, safer, and opened the door to a whole new era of comfort. And comfort meant freedom. You could wear your glasses all day without getting a headache or leaving marks on your nose. They no longer just worked, they fit. Meanwhile, contact lenses, around since the late 19th century, finally became soft, wearable, and commercially viable in the 1950s and 60s. Suddenly, people had a choice. You could correct your vision without wearing anything on your face. A liberating thought for many, but for others, glasses were just getting good, because now fashion stepped in. The 60s gave us cat-eye frames with their swooping drama and glamorous curves. Women wore them with pride on red carpets in offices and behind steering wheels. Glasses were no longer what your grandmother wore, they were what style looked like. The 70s, oversized aviators. Think gold rims, gradient lenses, disco-era swagger. The kind of glasses that didn't whisper, they sang. By the 80s, things got bigger, bolder, brasher. Square frames, neon accents, tinted lenses. Wall Street executives, rappers, punks, everyone had their own look. Glasses became a statement, not a solution. And as always, the pendulum swung back. The 90s ushered in minimalism, sleek rimless styles, wire-thin frames. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and university professors wore them like quiet armor. Every decade had its look, its voice, its lens. And behind it all, people were seeing better and being seen differently. But there's another side to this story. As fashion evolved, so did science. The field of optometry exploded. Eye exams became more precise. Vision correction became more tailored. Progressive lenses, first introduced mid-century, got better and better, offering seamless transition between reading, middle, and distance vision. Then came the digital age. As screens took over first computers, then smartphones, then tablets and smartwatches, our eyes faced a new kind of fatigue. Blue light, eye strain, dryness, blurred focus. We were looking, scrolling, reading for hours. So lenses adapted again. Blue light blocking coatings were introduced, promising relief from digital fatigue and even better sleep. Whether or not the science was airtight, one thing was clear: people wanted protection, not just clarity. Frame materials evolved too: titanium, carbon fiber, memory metal that bent and bounced back, hypoallergenic coatings, 3D printed frames. You could now find glasses as light as a feather or as rugged as a helmet. And they didn't just look better, they felt better. And of course, we can't forget smart glasses. Google Glass made headlines in the early 2010s. It was awkward, controversial, a bit ahead of its time, but it kicked open a door. Now companies like Meta, Apple, and Amazon are racing to build the next generation, AR-enhanced eyewear that can overlay digital content onto your real-world view. Maps, messages, translations, a world of information right in your line of sight. It's not just about seeing anymore, it's about interacting. And yet, for all the tech, all the fashion, all the innovation, there's something beautifully human that hasn't changed. Glasses still tell a story. A child putting on their first pair and seeing leaves on trees. A grandmother reading bedtime stories clearly again. A teenager discovering their style through a frame. A coder, an artist, a poet. Glasses quietly shaping how they see and are seen. Today, you can try on glasses online. You can upload a selfie, order lenses shipped to your door. Personalize every detail, color, shape, material, function. And what started as two convex lenses in a medieval monastery is now a billion-dollar industry, a cultural mainstay, and a symbol of clarity in a world that's often anything but clear. So next time you clean your lenses, or pick out a new pair, or even just put them on before reading a good book, pause for a second. You're not just adjusting vision. You're stepping into a long, shimmering lineage of monks and merchants, of artists and astronomers, of thinkers and dreamers. And you too are seeing the world more clearly, one lens at a time. So where were we? Ah yes, on the edge of something wild. Because just when you thought glasses couldn't possibly evolve any further, we stepped across the line between biology and technology. Not just tools for seeing, but extensions of the self. Let's start with what's already happening. Today, your glasses aren't just ground and cut to your prescription. They're sculpted by computers with micron-level precision. They take into account not just your vision, but how you tilt your head, how far you typically read from your face, even the way your eyes move across a page. These aren't your grandfather's bifocals. These are progressive lenses that eliminate the warping and dizziness that used to plague earlier versions. They transition so smoothly across focal zones, near, mid, far, that some users forget they are even wearing them. And that's just the beginning. Enter adaptive lenses. These are being tested right now in labs and early markets. Lenses that automatically adjust their focal length. Imagine a lens that shifts focus the way a camera does. No switching glasses. No nodding your head to find the sweet spot. Just clear sight in real time. It's possible because of technologies like liquid crystal lenses and electrochromic polymers. Fancy words for materials that respond to electricity or light. When a sensor detects that you're reading or driving or walking outdoors, the lens reacts, becoming sharper, darker, or clearer depending on your environment. And while that sounds futuristic, it's already here. Now let's go deeper, literally. Scientists are exploring gene therapy for certain inherited forms of blindness. This isn't about fixing vision with glasses. It's about changing the genetic code itself so the eye can begin to repair what's broken. In trials, patients with previously untreatable conditions are regaining partial vision. They're seeing light where there was only dark, shapes where there was only blur, faces sometimes for the first time. And then there's bionic vision. Yes, bionic. Retinal implants are being developed, tiny electrodes placed in or near the retina that connect to a camera worn on glasses or directly transmit signals to the brain. These systems don't restore natural sight, not yet, but they offer outlines, movement, contrast, enough to navigate, to recognize a door, to see someone approaching. It's raw, it's limited, but it's real, and the future. It gets even wilder. Brain-computer interfaces, BCI, are emerging. These are devices that could eventually translate visual information directly into the brain, bypassing the eyes entirely. Imagine a world where blindness isn't a barrier, where sight can be delivered neuron to neuron. It sounds like science fiction. But then again, so did glasses once upon a time. Of course, glasses aren't going away. Even as the science surges forward, style is keeping eyewear rooted in the now. Designers are crafting 3D printed frames from sustainable materials, wood fibers, recycled plastics, biodegradable polymers. Modularity is hot. You can swap temples, reshape nose bridges, change frame fronts with a click, like wardrobe for your face. Some brands are even letting you custom print your own pair, complete with engravings, digital accents, and color shifts based on temperature or mood. Yes, mood. Meanwhile, virtual and augmented reality are learning from centuries of optical evolution. VR headsets are becoming slimmer, lighter, more comfortable because they've borrowed from glasses, from lenses, from centuries of trial and error in how the human face wears technology. And here's a thought. What if the future of glasses is no glasses? What if correction moves inside into implants, neural chips, or regenerative medicine? What if your eyes age, but your vision doesn't? It's not a dream anymore, it's a horizon. And yet, despite everything, glasses remain one of the most human inventions we've ever made. They sit quietly on the bridge of our noses, transforming the way we experience the world. They carry decades of memory, of a child squinting at a chalkboard, of a mother reading in the soft light of evening, of a grandfather adjusting his frames to better see the smile of someone he loves. So yes, smart glasses, digital coatings, adaptive lenses, bionic vision, it's all dazzling. But sometimes what matters most is the moment when you put on a pair of glasses and the world snaps into focus. Not just visually, but emotionally. It's the moment when you realize you're not broken. You just needed a lens. And maybe in the end, that's all any of us ever needs, something to help us see clearly, to help us navigate the blur, to remind us we're still part of the story. From the squinting monks in stone monasteries, hunched over flickering candlelight, to the silent genius of Kepler bending light with math. From horn-rimmed spectacles passed from merchant stalls to scholars, to virtual lenses that whisper data into our field of view, every age has left its fingerprint on the humble eyeglass. But now let's shift lenses one more time, not to look forward but inward. Why does this story matter? Because glasses, simple, quiet, unassuming, have always been more than tools for sight. They've been companions, bridges, equalizers. They gave the aging monk back his scriptures, the tired mother her child's drawings, the stargazer his telescope, the student her future. They reminded people that losing clarity didn't mean losing value. And isn't that the heart of history itself? Each generation peering into the haze of their own time, reaching for something clearer. Sometimes we stumble, sometimes we invent, but always we try to see better. And that's what this story has been all along, a story of clarity, of resilience, of quiet revolution, not with thunder or banners, but with lenses, with patience, with the human refusal to accept blur as the end. So if you wear glasses or know someone who does, you're not just carrying around a piece of plastic and metal. You're wearing centuries of progress. You're honoring the legacy of those who refuse to live in the dark. You're seeing, quite literally, the world as it was meant to be seen, with precision, compassion, and light. And if tonight your own vision is tired, if the letters begin to blur or your eyes are heavy, that's okay too. Because clarity isn't just what you see, it's how you feel. It's the peace that comes when a blurry world begins to focus. It's the comfort in knowing that even now someone somewhere is sharpening a new lens, designing a better frame, writing the next chapter. You're part of that story. And now, as the lights dim and the world softens, maybe it's time to rest your own eyes. Maybe it's time to slip off your glasses, fold them carefully, and lay them by your bed. You've seen enough for today. Let the dreams come now. Let the mind wander. Because vision isn't just for the waking, it's for the sleeping too. The stories we carry into sleep, the faces we remember, the worlds we visit in the quiet dark, those too are lenses, and tomorrow we'll wake and see again. But for now, close your eyes, take a breath, and know this. You've looked through time tonight, and time somehow looked back. Good night.